the First World War, Russia became a communist country, which caused the US to respond with fear, due to communism's tendencies towards domestic human rights abuses, compounded with its expansionism. The United States and Russia, which was then the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR, both viewed each other as threats to their own existence and sought to eliminate one another. Additionally, they were also convinced that the other was expansionist, and these actions confirmed these convictions. For instance, in 1918, American troops were sent to Russia in an attempt to prevent the existence of a communist government. The US first formally recognized the existence and authority of the USSR in 1933 due to desperation for trading partners during the Great Depression and a desire to counteract Japan's increasing foreign influence and power. US President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin became allies in December 1941 after German Chancellor Adolf Hitler declared war on the US in order to help each other in the struggle against Nazism. The relations were still tense between the US and USSR. Some historians consider the Cold War, which occurred from 1946 to 1989, as completely inevitable due to events from 1917 to 1933, and consider their joint cooperation in World War II as a mere marriage of convenience, while others suggest that their continued cooperation into 1945 should have casted a hopeful outlook. At this point, it should be mentioned that US involvement in World War II began in December 1941 after the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor, not the invasion of Poland, one of the Soviet republics, and ended in September 1945.
On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally to the United States, and relations between the United States and the Soviet Union quickly fell apart due to conflicting interests, and in less than half a decade, they became enemies. Many contributing factors led to this, including their differing ideologies, the personalities of their leaders, and the relative power of the two nations. Before World War II, the US and the USSR had an uneasy relationship, so it is not surprising that the alliance did not operate smoothly, and that it eventually collapsed. Some sources of tension between the two nations included the atomic bomb and the fate of Eastern Europe. The USSR resented that the United States shared nuclear secrets with the UK, but refused to do so with the USSR. Similarly, the US resented that the USSR seemingly wanted to turn Eastern Europe into communist satellite states. Additionally, there was a great power discrepancy between the two countries, and even though the USSR was as powerful as it had ever been, it was a distant second compared to the US in terms of global power rankings. Additionally, at the time, the US was the only country with the atomic bomb, which made the USSR even more defensive and hostile towards the United States. The combination of all these aforementioned factors led to a great increase in the hostility between the two nations and eventually led to the outbreak of the Cold War.
There are several interpretations on why the Cold War began. One interpretation is the Orthodox interpretation, which states that Stalin's aggression and his takeover of Eastern Europe was the primary cause of the Cold War. This is believed to be true by several historians, such as Arthur Schlesinger. The revisionist interpretation, which is thought to be true by historians like William Williams, they blame America for the Cold War, saying that American desire to export freely both U.S. products and capitalist system forced the Soviet Union to take over Eastern Europe to shut off potential markets for U.S. products. Another interpretation is the post-revisionist interpretation, which states that the clash between competing systems was bound to happen, and mutual incomprehension and miscommunications were made. Like, for example, the US thought that Stalin assisted the Greek Communist Party after World War II, and this was simply not the case. And this is thought to be true by historians like Martin Macaulay. And post-revisionist historians are slightly correct in the sense that both nations were at fault to at least a small extent, and it's difficult to say which nation is more at fault, however. And historians will still continue to change their minds even when they're set on one thing because new information will come up.
The Truman Doctrine was a speech given by US President Harry Truman in front of Congress in March of 1947, which many historians consider the declaration of the Cold War. Truman felt compelled to give this speech due to the deterioration of Soviet-American relations. The USSR was responsible for creating a communist Eastern Europe. The split occupation of Germany, tensions between Greece and Turkey, and the US's desire for oil in Iran, a former Russian ally prior to the Cold War, served as additional sources of tensions between the two superpowers. The Greek Civil War was fought as a communist revolution which was not as a result of Soviet involvement, but the US did not trust the USSR, and relations were thus tensioned once more. Because of this, when the USSR pressured Turkey into allowing for post-World War II Russian naval access from the Black Sea and into the Mediterranean Sea, President Truman felt it was necessary to prevent this from occurring, whereas previously, during World War II, President Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill allowed for Soviet involvement in Turkey. President Truman asked Congress for $300 million for involvement in Greece and another $100 million for Turkish involvement, but Republican Senator Arthur Vandenberg convinced Democrat President Truman that Congress would be unwilling to do this without fear. Thus, he gave the Truman Doctrine, in which he described a world divided between free and unfree peoples, such that the US is responsible for defending the free. Similarly, Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin gave a speech in early 1946 in which he details the superiority of communism. The US State Department Soviet specialist George Kennan sent a long telegram from Moscow in February 1946 urging the US to resist Soviet expansionism. In 1947, he wrote an article for the prestigious journal Foreign Affairs, stating Soviet foreign policy was based on traditional Russian expansionism and Stalin's tendency for paranoia. He urged the US to contain the Soviet Union, thus leading to the policy of containment. The policy of containment was responsible for US involvement in the Korean War and the Vietnam War, a tense arms race between the US and USSR, and the desire on both sides to influence every country on every continent into adopting their respective economic system. The Truman Doctrine led to $13 billion in foreign aid being spent on reconstructing post-World War II Western Europe, and this political and economic cooperation was then complemented by military cooperation with the creation of NATO. NATO was founded partially in response to the Berlin blockade, in which the Soviet Union blocked West Berlin's access to food, electricity, and other supplies, which was overcome with the Berlin airlift, in which supplies were dropped from planes. Contemporary historians disagree regarding the effectiveness of the Truman Doctrine. On the one hand, it can be argued that containment was necessary for combating Russian expansionism, but on the other hand, it can be argued that it only led to undesirable foreign conflicts. Journalist Walter Lippmann criticized the Truman Doctrine, calling it an ideological crusade with no limits.
Although Roosevelt had worked hard to improve U.S.-Latin American relations, Truman faced a new set of Cold War-related challenges that threatened the newly improved relations. For one, the goals of the United States and Latin America after World War II were drastically different. While the U.S. focused on winning the Cold War and eradicating communism, Latin American nations sought developmental opportunities and economic aid. Throughout the beginning of the Cold War, the U.S. was successful in achieving their goals in Latin America. At the Rio Conference in 1947, all the participating nations agreed that one attack on a nation would constitute an attack on them all, establishing a U.S.-led collective defense policy in Latin America. Additionally, the Organization of American States, or OAS, was formed, which represented hemispheric unity in the face of communism. Throughout the Cold War, many Latin American nations cooperated with the United States to gain economic aid, and did things like banning their communist parties or reducing socialist programs. Even with these actions, the U.S. still tended to prioritize the rebuilding of Europe over the development of Latin America, and the U.S. did not perceive Latin America to be under immediate communist threat. However, not all actions in Latin America went in the United States' favor. Despite U.S. opposition, the UN set up the Economic Commission for Latin America, which criticized U.S. actions in the continent, arguing that the cause of Latin America's poverty was that it was simply a supplier of raw materials for U.S. industry. However, throughout the Cold War, U.S. policy in Latin America was generally successful.
In the midst of all this time, the ever-growing fear of communist ideas in the U.S. became so large that Congress created a new committee known as the House Committee of Un-American Activities, and at the head of it all was Senator Joseph McCarthy. The HUAC and the Red Scare were one of the most famous examples of encounters between the American government and communism. HUAC was created in 1938 and lasted well into the 1950s in order to combat communism. One large portion of the movement, known as McCarthyism, was the blacklisting of Americans for being suspected of communism. The Cold War also orientated American education to be more STEM heavy. A new age developed, one that valued scientific superiority rather than arms. On the 26th of October 1957, the first artificial satellite Sputnik was launched into space, which began the space race. While Americans heard of Sputnik being launched, they were overpowered by fear. Later on, the United States launched the Apollo project, a series of space missions to counter the Soviet Union. One of these projects, Apollo 11, brought the first American on the moon. The last Apollo mission, a joint mission between the Soviet and the American Apollo, marked the end of the space race. It took place in 1975 when 3 Americans and 2 Russian cosmonauts met for the first time in space. This is one of the few exchanges between the United States and the Soviet Union.